Hey, it's Mazzy here, and I hope this started from scratch again. We had a little technical difficulty, but I'm here with Sasha Berliner, who is a wonderful vibraphonist, was a drummer, vibraphonist. It turns out we are both San Francisco natives. I have to show that because I don't know about you, but San Francisco for many years was my identity, and now I'm in Seattle, and Sasha's in New York City. We're here to discuss an album that came out 2 years ago now, recorded a little bit during the pandemic, and we'll get into that. This is Sasha Berliner, Onyx, and it's on the JMI label out of New York. And it prides itself in being an all analog to tape, cut all analog. And I want to talk to Sasha about the music here, the influences she got into, and finding her own identity. So you're not just doing what another vibraphone or any other musician does. You do your own thing. And the journey, if there's a difference cutting to vinyl or cutting to tape over digital. So welcome. Thank you for going through all the little audio glitches we had. You're a musician, and we usually have people that do this, right? Do you have a sound engineer occasionally?
Yeah, I mean, not for Zoom meetings
No,
or interviews, unfortunately, but yes,
exactly.
normally.
So
Yeah.
talk about this. We started chatting a little bit about it. First of all, I love the cover artwork, and
Mhm.
I love the little detail of using the stretch canvas. If you know art pieces, whoever put this together and designed it, it's great. And then later, I want to get into the musicians you work for. Are these musicians you normally work with? Do you have a band you play with regularly and all that? So I know it's a lot to digest. That's 10 questions in one, but uh, tell me your journey and your musical journey here.
Uh,
This
as
record.
it pertains to Onyx, yeah. So I was writing a bunch of music during the pandemic. I really wanted to release it, but I wasn't sure what it's like sort of releasing music during the pandemic when you don't know how many people are going to be buying music, listening. I mean, people are definitely going to be listening to music, but it's an issue of income, it's an issue of just trying to get by, illness, all sorts of stuff, you can't tour the album, so, does it make sense to record and or release one? But I also figured that, it had been a while since I had released a recording, and I really wanted to do something once I was finally out of college to sort of show my musicianship had advanced and just to show some more relevant work. And at the same time, very coincidentally, JMI had reached out saying they had heard my first album. They were really interested in recording me. So they yeah, we basically, I talked more with Jake and Steve, the founders of the label, and we talked about making something happen. We talked about musicians, and I guess this was, yeah, December of 2020 was when we
So
recorded that.
right in the smack dab in the middle of everything, you
Yeah,
got
I remember
your
everyone's still
studio.
wearing masks.
Now you were
Distance.
live in the studio relating to each other, which to me is the best way to record music when the musicians are there. You were there. This was not done, obviously, since it's not digital, not through, everybody recorded records, it seems like, throughout the world from different places at home. This was
Yeah.
actually getting in a studio and
Yeah. So I do remember that like we all had to take COVID tests and we had to be really on top of that kind of thing. But once everyone had taken COVID tests, then, it was mostly no mask in the studio, just because there's maybe like six or seven of us. Sorry, my cat is trying to intercept the interview here. You might
I
see
think
her.
your cat stopped the audio last time, possibly. I don't know.
Maybe it was her. I wouldn't
So
be.
is this material that you had worked out prior to this, or was it specially written for the album?
Um, it was I didn't really have a plan for it because I didn't know, whether or not I was even going to be able to release music at that time or record. I just didn't know what the future was kind of looking like at that time. But it was still music I was working on, new songs I was working on, and I did envision them all being part of the same album. But I think maybe there's one or two songs that I wrote maybe a couple years before the pandemic, and they kind of fit in really well with the music on the album, so I ended up including them.
And you have here, you have a, it's a quintet, including yourself.
Hmm.
You have sax, bass, drums, and keyboard, and you have a vocalist on one track, I believe, just one.
Yeah.
And for those of you, I should point out, it's obvious, but it's a jazz record. You're a jazz vibraphone player, but you came from the drums, I understand. You went to the School of Art in Oakland, and you wanted to go in as a drummer, but typical, too many drummers,
Yeah, no,
one drummer in a band.
exactly. I could have gone as a drummer, but I think they sort of felt like it wouldn't maximize my experience and my time there, that I might, if there's already 7 drummers and the school is not very big, maybe 90 kids per class or something like, and that's not even, that's not just the music school, that's all of the other departments. So like that was a lot of drummers for one program for a school that small. And so they were thinking, if you want to maximize your time, you might want to consider seeing if you'd be interested in learning a different instrument. We have this vibraphone that's in the percussion family and nobody's playing it, if you're interested in learning it. And at that point, I really wanted to go to music school, and I was interested in learning more melodic and harmonic uh, sides of the music, I guess. I had only really self-taught like a couple of major scales, but I was interested, so
And the
kind of
vibraphone's
made
really the
sense.
only, isn't it the only sort of melodic percussive instrument? I mean, marimbas, vibraphone, that whole family. I mean, because, I know about drummers tuning drums and getting different sounds from different drums and everything, but you could hit a drum, yeah, a tom-tom or a snare. Now that I'm simplifying because
Of course.
my very
Yeah.
little knowledge as a drummer when I was a kid, very like 1 year, then I switched to guitar. You can hit it anywhere and get the sound you want for the band. And obviously, some drummers tune their drums, but when you're doing mallets and you're doing on a vibraphone, you have to, especially it's a wide instrument, and you have to hit the right note, the right, what do you call it, the bar? What do they call the bars?
Yeah, yeah, the bars,
They're
yeah.
called bars, literally called bars.
Mhm.
Okay. So that must have been a big difference learning the melody and learning, I guess, music. And I assume you write music, you read music.
Yeah, yeah, of course. I mean, that's kind of commonplace in the jazz community, just because, I mean, you're expected to learn a lot of stuff by ear, but if you have like challenging arrangements and not a lot of time, bringing charts can kind of shorten the amount of time. And just give like a roadmap, or a number of things, or if you have something specific written out and again you have a time limit, it's easier to have it on a chart. But yeah, I mean, I started writing music kind of right around the time that I, maybe like a year after I had been studying vibraphone already. I mean, I didn't really know how to approach composition at that point because it was also new to me, but yeah, it was one of the things that made me want to do music professionally, actually, was the aspect of composing music, not just improvising or performing. Like, I really liked the compositional aspect. So that was kind of a great thing that I got out of playing the vibraphone.
Now, this is a whole thing because I've taught in art school before on the photography side, but more on for me being a photo agent on the business side. But there is the good, bad, and ugly of art schools and music schools. I know
For sure.
about teachers who are there for years, sometimes decades, that don't seem to have an awareness of what's going on currently,
Yeah.
and stale in that. And then there's others that come. And for me, I wasn't a full-time teacher. I came from my business. So I kind of knew what was going on in the world out there. Not, how was that? And did you have, obviously, I assume you had guest instructors occasionally, musicians that came on. I understand you also worked with Stefan Harris, who's an amazing vibraphone, probably one of the famous modern, most, there's a
Yeah,
handful
yeah.
of them. And so how did that influence you also?
Yeah, I mean, I would say both for OSA, Oakland School for the Arts, and for New School where I went to college, there are some instructors who are very tethered to a traditional idea of jazz. There are a lot of instructors who are more open-ended. They want to hear your compositions. They're sort of like whatever you want to bring into class, whatever you want to, study. And then there are teachers who kind of split it down the middle, where they really want you to cultivate your own voice, but they also stress the importance of knowing the fundamentals and being able to play those and articulate those things, with a degree of mastery. And I think those teachers were like the most successful teachers for me. And Stefan was definitely one of those teachers because he has such a foundation. He has all the jazz language, like you can hear it in his improvisation and his playing and his methodology, but he also curated his own methodology in terms of approaching like a more sort of a modern sound of improvisation, a certain way of teaching phrasing to be really relaxed. He was always concerned with like having the vibraphone sound closer to the human voice, which is tricky as a percussion instrument, but it makes the instrument really sing. And also an aspect of harmony that really adds depth to compositions and improvisation and stuff. And that kind of stuff really changed the way that I looked at compositions and at adding colors and stuff to music when you don't have like a singer to give emotional, inflection or input. How do you get that through instrumental music?
Well, okay, so when you wrote for this album,
Hmm.
when you write a piece, and I know it's every time I talk to musicians that write, people write differently. Sometimes sometimes they have one direction they go, one style they go. Whether it's if you're in rock music, if you're writing on the piano, you're working your lyrics or something first, and then you play your melodies, or you just hear a tune in your head. Are you thinking of actually writing it out first, or are you just literally taking your mallets and working on melodies and see what comes out?
Yeah, I challenge myself to composing in a different way every time just because I feel like if I start my compositions the same way that they tend to kind of come out the same way, or not necessarily, but I want to, challenge myself to starting compositions in different ways with different approaches, I guess. So there are some songs I started with vamps or bass lines, and then there are some songs that started with the melody. Some songs that started with maybe a figure in the piano or something like that,
You
something
play
small.
piano as well?
Yeah, so I tend to write, at least when it comes to like skeletons of ideas, I tend to write on piano because
Okay.
it has a bigger range of notes than the vibraphone. So I can really hear like how does the bass range sound? How does the treble range sound? Like, but the vibraphone doesn't have a bass range, so it's a little hard to hear that kind of stuff. But then like when I write solo stuff like the My Funny Valentine Part 1, I did that all on vibraphone.
Well, let me mention that. All but two tracks on here are original compositions. The two tracks on side two, the opening tracks, there's an instrumental version of My Funny Valentine, that great classic, whether it's been, the standard songbook stuff. Obviously, Chet Baker does a great version. On the music side, Elvis Costello did a great version. It's been covered by so many people. And then she goes into the full band, I think, version, right?
Mhm.
Version two, Valentine two, which really goes in an interesting direction and more of an intense direction, and almost, really almost stays away from the initial melody, maybe. Is that?
Yeah, yeah, no, you totally
Yeah.
noticed that. I actually, so there's no
So why call it My
melody.
Funny Valentine? No.
Yeah, there's no melody in part two at all. The
Okay,
melody is
okay.
in
I thought,
part
is that
one.
just me? Did I miss the melody there?
No, you didn't. You're totally right
Why
about
why give them the publishing then on it? So I'm just
it's their chord changes, and
got it.
ultimately I got the idea for the tag, which is sort of central to, it's in part one and part two, the like da 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 da, like the
Yeah.
beginning part of part two is introduced in part one. Um, but that is funny though.
Hey,
Yeah,
I think I'm an agent. I think like a businessman. You want to get the publishing, own your own. Don't ever sell your publishing, Sasha.
of
That's
course.
yeah.
Yeah, but in this case, yeah, so I basically split it up where I have the first section. It's almost like introducing the melody, doing an intro, all rubato, right? By myself, rubato's out of time.
Yeah.
Um, I sort of it comes out differently every time, whether I play it in the studio or I play it live. It's not exact. Like there's still a huge amount of that intro that's improvised, but I did write like a more or less a structure, and there are some parts of it that are through composed, I guess. Um, and then part two is basically just the tag and the solos. So it's like the solo section of the song. The only thing is that we don't revisit the melody at the end. So normally with jazz tunes, you have the head melody, the solos, and then you do the melody at the end. But for this version and at that tempo and everything, the melody just it would have sounded corny or something.
Yeah.
Like I don't know, it just didn't make sense to return to the melody at that tempo. Like I loved the fact that the melody was presented out of time, because to me that's the way that I wished, I don't know, that's the way that the melody really spoke to me more than the original. Maybe because it's been overdone or it's been used so many times. Like I like to take classic songs, that we've all heard and we're all familiar with, and present them in totally different, maybe sometimes even unrecognizable contexts, because there's something familiar about it, but it doesn't, maybe it conjures up like new emotions or new, I don't know,
Oh,
sonic
so
explorations.
when you got into, I'm going to lead up to this. And when you have these conversations, or when I have them, you go in the future and you go in the past. And when you started playing the vibraphone 8 years ago, 10 years ago, almost, 8 years ago, whatever, was it your plan or to go in the jazz route opposed? Because it seems to me the vibraphone is really a classical instrument or a jazz instrument. I mean, rock bands use it occasionally as a supplemental thing. I don't know many, Zappa used it on with the Mothers of Invention, and
Yeah,
on Electric Ladyland, a guy named Buzzy Linhart played the vibes on with Jimi Hendrix. But there's not a lot of bands with a regular vibraphonist or marimba player unless you get into Latin jazz or things like that, or
sure.
Latin music. So was that a conscious thing I know you studied the jazz route, you like a major maybe, if that is
Mhm.
the thing there. How did you decide, and had you listened to a lot of jazz prior to this period?
I would say before I started on the vibraphone, no, I hadn't listened to a lot of jazz. I didn't really grow up listening to it. It wasn't something I think that my parents that really spoke to my parents, but at the same time, I think, but it's not that they didn't know. I think my dad saw Miles Davis live. Like I remember like listening to Billie Holiday or Ella Fitzgerald like once in a while growing up, but we were really more of a rock centric household. Just because that was the music that kind of spoke to my parents, and it was also the music that my dad played, because he's played bass his whole life,
He's a
and
musician as well. Okay.
yeah, and the bands that he was in were all like rock or punk bands.
Were they
So I
playing
think
around
it's
San
just,
Francisco? Were they, maybe I saw them. There's a,
yeah, he was in this band called Alice Donut. Um,
I,
and they opened once for Primus, that he always says
yeah,
that was like a highlight. And obviously Primus is a really cool band.
that's some bass playing. I mean,
Yeah, exactly. So I think it was a
that's
huge honor for my
Claypool.
dad.
Yeah. Oh God. Just, I mean, he's unusual, a whole different direction. Yeah.
Yeah, but anyways, yeah, I hadn't had much experience with jazz. I just knew, oh, you can learn how to improvise, and I thought that was really cool because I didn't really know how to do that. Like I could do a drum fill or I could take a drum solo, but that's not the same as like improvising with like a harmonic framework or that kind of thing. I just wasn't used to it at all. And I was also interested in learning how to read sheet music and be able to make my own charts and write out things in addition to learning them by ear. I think because I knew it would allow me to create larger compositions and larger works, those the types of things that are harder to teach by ear because there might be so many sections or, you know. So I think that uh yeah, that all kind of came about when I started. And Yeah, I mean, I would say even today, like as much as you can call me a jazz vibraphonist, and certainly the vibraphone has mostly occupied jazz and classical contexts,
Right, right.
that I'm interested in removing it from those contexts or just seeing it as, an instrument that doesn't have to be specific to a certain genre presentation.
Now
I think
this,
you can hear that on Onyx
yeah,
a little.
this is a very accessible record, but sometimes it dips its toe a little bit into, I wouldn't say free jazz at all, but a little bit of spiritual at a touch and other areas. Would
Yeah,
you
sure.
ever, in fact, one thing it relates to this. I watched some of your live performances recently on YouTube, and I know you have upcoming. If anyone's watching this, I know I have people in New York and stuff that you have a series of dates at Smalls, which is a great little club in New York, right? Don't you have some dates coming up?
Yeah, yeah. I'm
You do a
returning
regular
from Europe.
thing at Smalls?
Yeah, I usually do like a weekend at least every year, if not twice a year. I usually play with
Okay.
my group at least twice a year.
And is that the same group here, or is it a different group?
No, this will be a different group.
Okay.
It's very hard to secure this group of musicians.
Yeah.
They're all very
I
busy.
realize also, I mean, I know like three of these guys, but I noticed that Marcus Gilmore, your drummer, isn't he like the grandson of Roy Haynes?
Yes,
Oh,
yeah.
wow.
And he's
That's
incredible.
jazz
Yeah.
DNA and out there DNA in some cases too.
Yeah, yeah, and I looked up to Marcus's playing for years, in a number of different groups that he's played in, and whether with Chick Corea or Vijay Iyer, or any number of people. Um, so it's just an honor to even have gotten to work with him. I think he interpreted my music and my style super well. It was a huge reason why I wanted him to play drums. But when it comes to gigs and stuff, he's certainly super
Yeah. In
busy and,
demand, right?
he's been on the scene for so long and he has a kid and everything. So, of course, we'll play together every once in a while, but it is hard to secure him for like a local kind of date unless I have enough like time in advance to really secure him for that.
Now, as you play, one thing also I noticed, and maybe this is a surprise to me because I'm not well versed on the vibraphones in terms of the technical side of it. I saw on at least one of the thing actually use almost like guitars using pedals. And
Mhm,
is that a common thing with jazz musicians putting the sound through pedals? Obviously every guitarist has these pedal bays now and
for
these
sure.
foot things, right? It's like you can't go on stage without a pedal if you're in a rock band, at least. But is that a common thing? And is that something that I didn't notice that any kind of altered sounds on the vibraphone on this record? Is that something you're going to do more, for instance, in future recordings and performances?
Yeah, so I would say first of all, it's not common. I think there are a couple of vibraphonists who use pedals and effects and stuff, more now than ever.
Purists hate
And
it. Like,
huh?
do purists hate it? Like you're altering the sound of this beautiful acoustic percussive instrument.
I think it's just another option. I mean, as you can hear, like I don't use it all the time. But in certain settings, I think it's really cool. I think why not have both? And there's a vibraphonist today named Simon Moulier who uses pedals. It sounds really cool. Patricia Brennan as well. She has a record doing like solo vibraphone and electronics. That's really beautiful. I think Mike Mineri had introduced it a little bit, but maybe it was just more like r- reverb and delay and nothing crazy. And certainly, I think the video you must have seen me do, I was using some more experimental stuff that can kind of go a
And I
little
will
more.
say they weren't for guitars out there. They weren't foot pedals. They were literally up on a. I don't know if they were on the side. They were up on a desk or a table or something, right?
Yeah, so sometimes I can put pedals by my feet, but it's a little tricky because I have to use the pedal on the vibraphone, so I can like lose my balance or miss a pedal like when I need to hit it with my foot, which actually did happen in real life. And so, um, and if I'm using the loop pedal, it allows me to be a little more hands off, so I can like go and use it rather than with my foot. But I might try to mess with that configuration a little more. Anyways, The reason why it's a little bit, there's a couple of spots where you might hear it on Onyx, on Jade. There's sort of this
The
warbly
opening track.
effect in the background.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
that was actually from running the vibraphone through this Mooger Fooger pedal that they had at Electric Garden where we recorded, and just taking the wet signal only and no dry signal, and just having that as a track that sort of ran behind all of the music to kind of create this effect. But we were limited again because of the all analog thing. So a lot of my pedals are digital, and so
Got it.
I couldn't use
Let me
them.
ask you this, because again, I'm naive about is the vibraphone always acoustic where you're mic'd, or do you ever go directly in a board or in an amp?
Yeah, so with my pickup system, it has a mixing box that has like a direct out, so I can go through a DI or use like an XLR or something. Standard vibraphone doesn't have that. I think people get confused. There's a plug maybe for the motor, but the motor just makes the
Right.
plates
It's usually an
inside the
acoustic
tube
instrument.
spin.
So do you usually do an overhead mic, one mic, or two mics on?
Yeah, yeah. So I'm getting there. The
Oh,
the the motor is the thing that you plug in to create the vibrato. Some
got it.
people think that's the amplification, but it's not. A vibraphone doesn't naturally come with amplification. So yeah, we usually you do like two microphones either overhead, or I try to go under because I have a tendency to hit the microphones. Um, and I don't want to break anybody's microphone. I actually did that at a concert with Tyshawn Sori like a couple years ago, and I broke one of the mics by hitting it when I was playing. So, but it also depends on the kind of mic. Um, the vibraphone does really well with like large diaphragm
Mhm.
microphones, ribbon mics, that kind
An
of thing. You don't,
RCA.
yeah, but you don't always get that when you're playing like a live show, unfortunately.
Do you
So,
get a different muffle sound putting the mic underneath? Because you're sort of you're in like a half box, aren't you, underneath, opposed to all the openness above?
well,
Does that matter?
yeah, I mean, it's still the tubes, and the sound is can come through the tubes, and I think it's not as muffled, especially if you have like the right mic for it. But uh when you do use the pickup system, because the pickups are connected directly to under the bars, and then they basically they're plugged into this rail that is on the frame of the instrument and out to this mixing box. Um, that sound actually can be a little muffled. It sounds a little close. So I kind of like to mix that DI sound I get from the pickups and the microphone sound. So it doesn't sound too, you kind of lose a lot of that natural like reverberation and overtones and stuff like that when you use the pickup system. So I like to mix the sound of the mic sound and the DI sound, even
Okay.
when I use effects.
Okay. Now, as you move ahead, am I understand that you're working on a new record now, or you're looking to record something new in the next year?
Yeah, I'm actually in the process of doing that right now. So I'm recording something next week and then doing another session, maybe 2 weeks, 2 or 3 weeks from now in New York. So I have both a session in Los Angeles and a session in New York lined up, and I'm going to hopefully combine them to make it part of one album to sort of showcase like my influences from both the West and East Coast. And I think
West
that,
Coast cool jazz and East Coast. Yeah, yeah, okay.
yeah, yeah. Well, and I think that,
You know
yeah,
the cliche of like
it's
the
a cliche, but there's also something to that
oh, absolutely.
idea. So,
The Art Peppers of the world and the Shelly Manns and all that, the West Coast stuff that was happening and the East Coast.
yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I think the Los Angeles jazz scene is really interesting right now, and there's a lot of incredible musicians involved in this scene, but also, the New York scene has always been amazing, has always been something that that has changed my
Yeah.
playing permanently, and obviously I sort of work between both coasts now, but
You do. Okay. I didn't know that.
yeah, I wanted that to be central to this next album. And how did those two influences kind of come together to form where I'm at right now. So
Do you cross over, or do you have any interest in crossing over from the jazz? There's a whole thing, whether it's the avant-garde and neoclassical and minimal and ambient music is, I don't want to say popular, but obviously jazz, you're talking about the pandemic and you weren't sure if things were selling. And the interesting thing is people bought friggin' records so much during the pandemic. They had nothing else to do. They were getting their PPP money or their non-unemployment and buying records, and records were selling. Everything spiked. And I've known so many people that are older that have been in rock forever that opened up with this release of obviously like JMI records here, the Tone Poets that are coming out, Joe Harley stuff,
yeah.
all that analog, beautiful classic Blue Note stuff, as well as Impulse and everything else, and even the avant-garde stuff. So does that interest you? Would you open up and mix avant-garde, jazz, free, neoclassical, or is that too much at this point?
No, I don't ever write myself off with anything. I'm open to going all sorts of directions with the music, especially like if I collaborate with somebody who really specializes in one of those genres or aspects of the music. But, I would say that my albums are already not super traditional jazz, so it's no surprise at all that I would in the future be releasing albums that are very loosely tied to jazz, if at all. But I think that will always be a foundation of my work and my playing and even like my compositional process. There's always a balance of improvisation and through composed stuff, harmonic frameworks and techniques. Those all kind of like are derived from what was birthed in the jazz world. But yeah, ultimately I don't like to label myself and say this is jazz music and I'm only going to be known as a jazz musician who plays jazz music their whole life. Like
Got it.
I've never really felt that way.
Okay, before I close off, I do want to go through some albums. I pulled my collection, some vibraphonists, and I'm not sure if you're into any of these artists or not, but I do want to ask a question I was alluding to before. You started out on the drums, and I understand you were playing rock and roll. Like, what did you have bands back when you were playing drums?
Yeah, so
What area of rock music?
well, a bunch of different areas. So I was involved in this program called the San Francisco Rock Project.
Oh
It
yeah,
was
I know it.
basically birthed out of there
Yeah.
was actually a Paul Green School of Rock, which is a franchise, right? Where yes, it's kind of loosely like the movie where you have these openings or these places all around the US where kids can basically go and rehearse rock music and songs and stuff like that and put on shows. Sometimes the shows have themes based on certain artists, like Led Zeppelin or Pink Floyd, or, in our case, we did Frank Zappa, and that was like one of my first introductions to like mallet instruments in general. Um, we do all kinds of stuff like that. And then basically the School of Rock closed and the SF Rock Project opened independently as a result of that place closing.
Is that down on
And
Harrison Street or something? Or no?
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I know it.
So I did that for many, many years. And basically we had a show band, which is to say that we did gigs around the city with songs that we had established in our set list. We were sort of guided by like an instructor who sort of helped curate our set list and help us, prepare for the sort of professionalism of playing live gigs. But we had a repertoire of basically rock songs, mostly covers, maybe one or two originals, but we were kids, so we
You could.
weren't really quite that
Do you remember
skilled.
any venues you played in San Francisco? I'm just curious. Obviously, you couldn't play in certain bars and stuff, but um,
Yeah, I mean, we did all kinds of stuff. I remember like we played uh like an election party, like for the day that Barack Obama got elected. Like
2008. Yeah.
yeah, we did like we played like an offshoot of Treasure Island music festival. Like
Yeah.
we've done all kinds of random stuff. And then there's like local gigs. We definitely played at the Rickshaw a couple of
Yeah.
times.
In
Like,
Hayes Valley. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Well, I love that
Stuff
little
like
place.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we definitely did a couple of things like that. Um, yeah,
Okay.
that's basically the kind of vibe. And
Have
then
you ever played here in Seattle? Have you ever?
I've played at Demetrius Jazz Alley.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I did.
There's also a cool little place, kind of, I'm in South Seattle, and it's called, the Royal Room. And the Royal Room,
Oh, I played the Royal Room too. I totally forgot.
that's down, yeah, and that is a place that, it's it's co-owned by Wayne Horvitz, who was part of the New York scene with John Zorn and
Yeah.
that whole scene of Lounge Lizards, John Lurie back that the 80s, I guess the 80s downtown scene, avant-garde jazz music thing. So it's a cool place if you ever come here again and play it. That
Yeah, yeah, I totally forgot. I played the Earshot Jazz Festival, and
oh
that's the venue that we played at.
yeah,
So,
it's a nice little room. It's a nice little room. I
yeah.
want to just before we kind of close out, ask you about some of these and just if they
Yeah.
influence you, if you like them or not. And obviously these are not outrageous to most people who know vibes and jazz will know them. Obviously, going back to the beginning, really, of the jazz is Lionel Hampton. Uh,
Yeah, of
you,
course.
you study these musicians in jazz school?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's sort of where when I talk about the fundamentals and the foundation, before you can really expand on what that is or do contemporary jazz, I feel like you have to have an understanding of, the origins. And Lionel Hampton like pioneered a lot of stuff in vibraphone playing. He was more percussive, say, than like Milt Jackson. He didn't use the pedal to quite the same extent, but he had not only incredible time and rhythmic feel, but really impressive use of like chromaticism, of dynamics. He had a lot of joy in his playing. And I think all of those things made him have such a signature sound on the instrument. And I've transcribed many of
Really?
his solos and
And
stuff like
and
that.
like you, he was a drummer, and then I think it was Louis Armstrong that said, "Hey, there's a vibraphone over there, play it,"
Yeah,
type of thing. You want to be in our school? Play the friggin' vibraphone. Just
that's
love that.
how a lot of us start with it.
Obviously Milt Jackson, one of my first, my almost my very first jazz album when I bought a component system was there's an album Stanley Turrentine called Cherry with Milt Jackson, and the
Yeah.
vibraphone on that on it's CTI, so it's got that really slick sound of CTI jazz records, and I
Hmm.
would suggest you Milt Jackson on Cherry. The opening track I think is a Lee Morgan or uh, wonderful, wonderful, called Speedball. And it's just
Oh, yeah.
not Lee
Yeah.
Morgan. Uh, anyway, someone will put it in the comments and say Maslov, you
Yeah, yeah.
fucked up. You don't know who that is, but that's a great
Yeah,
record. I mean,
Speedball. Yeah.
yeah. Anyway,
Right. That's
I'm
awesome.
I'm also a big fan. Jazz artists that don't get a lot of love is a modern jazz quartet or like a
Oh,
classical,
yeah.
and their records are so cheap. You can buy their used records so cheap. But I love that. But this is one of my favorites, and I feel fortunate enough because he lived in the Bay Area. He lived down the coast in Montera,
Yeah.
by Half Moon Bay, and so I would see him in the '70s, and it just love Bobby Hutcherson. I mean, what a great, great. I don't know your take on him?
I mean, he's one of my favorites. I think he had this element of like ballsiness and risk taking and adventurousness that I think was pretty new in terms of vibraphonist. And I think it's something that really spoke to me about his playing. And uh yeah, I don't know. There's just sometimes you'll hear him play something and you're like, what did you just play? Like,
Right.
I've never heard somebody play something like that on the vibraphone before. But he also like Lionel Hampton had a lot of joy in his playing. But he also introduced like a depth and like a mystery and all sorts of stuff that really spoke to me. Um, I remember like even when it comes to simple songs on that album, there's a great song called Bouquet that's sort of like a ballad. And I remember thinking like, this is a really interesting kind of ballad. It has a really interesting use of harmony, and it inspired like one of the songs I did for this live album in Germany in 2021. So,
Great, great.
anyways,
Yeah, great. I love that. All original songs except for Maiden Voyage, Herbie Hancock. Now,
sure.
this guy was all over San Francisco too, and I was able to see him. And it's amazing how Cal Jader, he does a couple, I think one record he does of Latin music for fantasy.
Yep, yeah, that's right.
It starts this whole craze, and fantasy almost makes them do every album a Latin, a marimba type, vibe record. Just cheap
Mhm.
records again. I had just showed this because we're, us San Francisco natives have to at least hold
Of
on a little
course.
bit to the city at the cable car turnaround there.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and that's probably not even a real cable. You know the phony cable cars they have in San Francisco? The
Oh,
one,
yeah, yeah.
I bet you they hired being a photo agent. They just decided to hire that. And then, of course, contemporary to you out of New York, Joel,
Yeah, yeah.
who I just missed him coming through here with the All Stars, I guess. Just
Oh, yeah, the Blue
great.
Note All-Stars.
Yeah, I love.
Yeah, Joel is great. He's a couple years older than me. I remember like seeing him live for the first time. I was a senior in high school and he was in college, maybe like a junior or senior. And he was competing at we were both at this Portland Jazz Fest like sort of competition. I was there for like a big band competition with my high school big band through ASAP Jazz, and he I think was competing for some collegiate like soloist competition that he ended up winning. And everyone's like, Sasha, do you know this new vibraphonist named Joel Ross? Like, it's coming up, you should really check him out. I remember being like, oh yeah, this guy is serious. Like,
Yeah,
and when I first came to New York, he was really good at supporting me and looking out for me. I remember like coming to his session at Smalls and he's like, come on, you gotta play, get in here. It was like my first time. I was so nervous. But yeah, I think Joel has really curated his own sound at this point. And people really remember him for that and for his honesty in the music. And obviously the church influence is really strong. And
oh, yeah,
uh,
the gospel side of it. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, absolutely.
Definitely, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah.
I, well, lastly, I want to, you mentioned SF Jazz, and I want to give them a shout. That's one of the greatest, I mean, in the West Coast. Obviously, they're building their organization. SF Jazz is in Hayes Valley, and it's got a great main theater and like a smaller loungy kind of performance space. And
Hmm.
I've been there a few times, and they sponsor a lot of times. So if you're in San Francisco and you get a chance, and they have different people curating the seasons and unlikely people. Like one season, they had Roseanne Cash, Johnny Cash's
Yeah, yeah.
uh, daughter, curate the jazz and crossed over to people like Ry Cooder and other artists. Anyway, and lastly, in terms of music, this is a totally different direction. One of my all-time favorite records, Malutu of Ethiopia. And
Yeah.
you know
I
this one, don't you?
I know I haven't checked it out like extensively, but I now this is a good reminder to
It
do that.
is. The
Yeah.
main record is short. This, I don't know if you do vinyl or not, but I'm sure you can online. This is a 3 record set, which has expanded stuff, and it's wonderful. 1972 originally. This is
Hmm.
funky motherfucker of a record too, because it's obviously vibes, and the vibes almost aren't the main part of it. He really started that Ethiopian jazz sound with funk music. There's wah
Yeah,
guitar on here. Obviously the Ethiopian African feel too, but it's just so good. This has been reissued on different levels. You can stream it, I'm sure, but
for
I
sure.
highly recommend this. A wholly different direction though. So
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. All that stuff is awesome.
right. Well, that was fun. Thanks for hanging out for 45 minutes or an hour. So I'm sorry we had a little glitch at the beginning,
No,
but
all good.
I'm going to put a link below. So in this, go to GMI Records, order this mother up. It's a beautiful record. You can, I'm sure, hear some of her performances on YouTube and check it out yourself. There's tracks there. And then
Yeah.
we look forward into this year or next year to a new album. You don't have a date yet or anything, a release date or anything, do you?
It should come out before the end of this year.
Okay.
Definitely.
Well, if you feel like chatting about it, I'm always open to chat about music, anything. So thank
Yeah,
you so much,
absolutely.
Sasha. And
Thank you.
San Francisco, right?
Yeah,
You
that's
always
right.
you do leave your heart there. Isn't that song like perfect? Even being a New Yorker now
It's
and stuff.
true.
So I get it. Okay, thanks for
Absolutely.
watching. I always say Mazzy loves you. Thanks, everyone.